That night was different from any other night in the house of Yaqub. The world outside was silent, as if time itself had stopped. Yusuf slept deeply, unaware that something had already been written for him beyond his understanding. In his sleep, he saw a vision that defied nature itself: the sun, the moon, and 11 stars bowing toward him. And when he woke, the feeling of that dream did not leave him. It stayed, like a secret waiting to unfold. Yusuf didn't wait long. He went straight to his father before the sun fully rose. There was something heavy in his chest, something he couldn't hold inside. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost uncertain. He told him what he had seen, the strange dream that still felt real. His father listened without interruption, but his expression changed, not in fear, but in understanding, because he knew this was not an ordinary dream.
The room stayed silent for a moment after Yusuf spoke. His father didn't rush to respond. He lowered his gaze, as if weighing something unseen. Then he spoke carefully, with a calm but serious voice. He told Yusuf not to share this dream with anyone, not even with those closest to him, because some truths attract attention before they are ready to survive it. And in that moment, Yusuf didn't fully understand the warning, but he remembered every word.
Far from that house, another world was beginning to form in silence. Yusuf's brothers moved together as they always did. On the surface, nothing had changed between them. They worked, they spoke, they walked side by side. But something small had already started to shift, unnoticed. A comparison, a feeling, a question that had no answer yet. And sometimes, the smallest feeling becomes the beginning of something much larger.
Among his brothers, Yusuf stood out, without trying. He was quieter, more composed, different in a way that couldn't be explained. While others moved loudly through life, he stayed calm, observant, distant in presence, but not in heart. And slowly, without words being spoken, that difference began to be noticed, not with anger yet, not with action.
Nothing was said openly. Nothing was questioned directly, but the human heart notices what the tongue ignores. A difference was there, and it kept repeating itself in small moments. A glance, a silence, a thought that stayed longer than it should. And slowly, without anyone planning it, comparison began to grow, not as action yet, but as feeling.
It was never spoken, it was never declared, but small things began to feel different. Who stood closer? Who was listened to longer? Who was noticed first? And in silence, the brothers started to feel something they could not yet name. Not anger, not conflict, just a quiet weight forming inside them every time they looked in the same direction. That night, the silence finally broke. One of the brothers spoke what others had been thinking but never said aloud. His voice was low, careful, but heavy with feeling. He questioned what they were seeing every day. He questioned the attention Yusuf was receiving. And for the first time, the feeling inside the group was no longer silent. It had become words.
Around the fire, the words grew quieter, but the thoughts grew heavier. It was no longer just observation, no longer just comparison. Something was forming between them, a question then another, then a possibility. And in the silence of that night, ideas began to take shape that had never been spoken before. Not action yet, but intention.
The conversation changed direction. It was no longer about feelings alone. It became quieter, more focused, more deliberate. Words were chosen carefully, as if each sentence carried weight beyond the moment. No one spoke openly of harm. No one crossed a line. But something subtle had shifted in the air between them. A direction was beginning to form, slowly, quietly, without being fully named. The brothers stayed near the fire. They talked in low voices. Some agreed, some stayed silent, but the idea was now clear between them. Something was being decided. The discussion continued. The voices stayed low. Then silence followed. A final look was exchanged. The decision was made. Morning came over the desert. The fire was gone. Only traces remained in the sand. The brothers left the place in silence. Each one returned to his path, carrying the same thoughts from the night before. Yusuf stayed in the house. The morning passed quietly around him. He moved as usual, without change. Outside, the world continued its routine, but the days ahead were no longer the same for everyone. The paths slowly separated. Some moved toward the desert. Others stayed closer to home. Life continued in different directions. But nothing that had started before was forgotten. That morning, they left as they always did. But something had changed in the silence between them. Yusuf remained standing for a moment longer than usual, watching their figures disappear into the desert. No one called him, and no one looked back. And for the first time, the distance between him and his brothers felt real. Not just in space, but in something deeper. Yusuf returned quietly. The settlement felt the same as before, but the day no longer did. He moved through familiar paths without speaking to anyone. Everything around him continued normally, as if nothing had changed. But inside the story, something had already started to shift in a way that could not be reversed. Even inside the house, silence followed him. He sat or stood quietly as the day passed around him. Life continued with its usual rhythm, voices and movement filling the space. But Yusuf remained slightly apart, observing more than speaking. And the feeling of distance, though unseen, was becoming part of his daily life. His name was mentioned in passing. Not loudly, not directly. Just in a quiet moment between conversations. A glance followed the words. Then another silence. Nothing obvious was said, but attention always returns to what stands out. Without saying anything, people began to notice him more often. Not because he changed, but because attention naturally returns to what stands apart. He continued his work quietly, without reacting to the gaze of others. Around him, conversations continued in the usual way, but something subtle had shifted in perception. And once something is noticed, it is rarely unseen again. Nothing was spoken directly, Life continued as normal. But something small had begun to settle inside them. A feeling that appeared in silence, not in words. They worked, they moved, they stayed together. Yet their attention kept returning in the same direction, and the more it repeated, the harder it became to ignore. By now, nothing needed to be said. Everything was understood without words. The distance was no longer only physical, it was becoming something they could all feel at the same time. They stood together, but not in the same way as before. Even silence had started to change its meaning, and what had been unnoticed at the beginning was now impossible to ignore.
The day slowly came to an end. Nothing had happened openly, yet everything had changed in silence. Yusuf remained as he was, calm, steady, unchanged. But around him, perception had shifted without words. The group stood together, yet something between them no longer felt the same. Not broken, not resolved, just different. And when silence stays long enough, it begins to feel like a decision waiting to happen.
Night fell over the desert. Everything returned to silence again. But this silence was no longer empty. It carried what had been building for many days without being spoken. Yusuf stood alone in the quiet night, as he always did. And far from him, others stood together, thinking the same thoughts in different ways. Nothing had happened yet, but everything was now in place for what was coming next.
Will Yusuf survive what his brothers have planned? Follow for part 2 to uncover the next chapter of this remarkable story.
If this video touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Sadaqah Jariyah starts with a single share. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next reminder, and leave a comment. Which sign of Allah amazes you the most? May Allah guide us all. Assalamu alaikum.